Hello and welcome to the Episcopal Church Foundation's Conversation with Bishops, asking the question, what is the role of the diocese in a changing church? My name is Haley Banky and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Program Innovation at ECF, where I serve with the team who created and runs the Diocesan Vitality Initiative. And this event today is one outcome from that program. First, we want to take a few minutes to offer background on what inspired this conversation, why ECF invited these particular bishops for this event, and the kind of deep systemic work that is taking place at the diocesan level. No more than 5 minutes, we promise. You will also note that the Q&A feature is not active. We have almost 700 people registered for this event and wouldn't be able to get to all of the questions. I will give information at the end for how you can follow up with a member of the ECF team. DVI is a pilot program at ECF where we partner with dioceses in identifying adaptive challenges and creating processes for renewal, redevelopment, and revitalization. The DVI experience is centered around a process of define, disrupt, and develop, or the 3 Ds. And through this process, diocesan teams define and understand their current context, disrupt systems that no longer serve mission, and develop practical methods to enhance local mission and ministry. The bishops participating on this panel lead dioceses who are currently engaged in this program. I recently had the opportunity to learn from Jack Hess at Civic Lab in Indiana, who is an expert on human systems and addressing systemic change. It is Hess's proposition that there are 4 ways to address a deep systemic problem in human systems, and I will use the example of homelessness to explain. When we get to the 4th way, this is the kind of work our participating bishops are undertaking. The first option is absolution, where an individual or leader chooses to absolve themselves from responsibility and doesn't deal with it at all. Using the example of homelessness, a person might say, there is nothing I can do about it, so it's not my problem. Someone else can handle it. The second option is resolution. In this scenario, a person might open a food bank, clothing ministry, or provide shelter for people to sleep at night. There's nothing wrong with this approach. It is the best way to impact the most people in the fastest way, but it doesn't solve the actual problems that cause homelessness. We need people pursuing resolutions, but we can't stop there. The third option, according to Hess, is solution. This is a step up from resolution where someone works directly with an individual to solve their problem. Again, this is a valuable way to address a problem, but it cannot be scaled to maximize systemic impact. And you might end up solving the same problem over and over, but for different people. You might help a housing insecure person with job training so that they can secure an income. You might help someone enter rehab to get the help they need with substance abuse. These solutions do good work, but they don't solve the overarching problem with the systems contributing to homelessness. The 4th option is dissolution. For dissolution, individuals and leaders look at the system as a whole, identifying the issues that are causing the initial problem, and then they reshape the system. In our example, this might be implementing job training courses in high school, or providing after-school care for working parents. You work to address the cause of the problem, not the problem itself. And this is the approach that DVI dioceses are taking as they engage the question, what is the role of a diocese in a changing church? Now you might be thinking, okay, I get the concept, but what is the problem? What challenges are dioceses facing in a changing church? And for that, I am pleased to introduce our moderator and panelists. Moderating our discussion today is Donald Romanek, President of the Episcopal Church Foundation. Donald, if you could turn on, there we go. Our panelists are Bishop Brian Pryor, is ECF's Bishop in Residence and DVI team member. Bishops Phoebe Roaf and Michael Hunn, whose dioceses are part of the pilot cohort for DVI. And Bishop Doug Scharf, whose diocese began its DVI journey this past January. I'll be back in a few minutes before the end of the event with some parting information. And Donald, I look forward to hearing the conversation, and thanks for taking the lead.
Well, thank you, Haley, very much for that introduction. And thank you for the people who signed up and are continuing to join this webinar. It's thrilling to be with you all today. Bishop Hunn, Bishop Phoebe Roaf, Bishop Scharf, and Bishop Pryor. Brian, I'm going to start with you because you are the senior bishop among us. And remind me when you first became diocesan bishop in Minnesota. What year was that?
That was 2010.
2010, shortly after Samuel Seabury, right?
Shortly. We passed as ships in the night.
I'm just going to open up the conversation. How has the role of the diocese changed since you first became diocesan bishop? And clearly, after you resigned, you stayed active in the House of Bishops. You're a coach to a variety of newer bishops. How has the role of the diocese changed, or how should it have changed over this period of time?
Thank you, Donald, and thanks to ECF and my colleagues here for being a part of this conversation. I think what I would say, I think you have to start in many respects. What happened was COVID. It was a significant impact on our diocese and our churches. And my experience is those of us who became bishops before COVID and those after COVID have a different experience. I mean, we all know that culturally that we've had a different experience, but I think that just made many things clear. For example, a lot of our congregations that were in a very thin place were not able to survive COVID. I mean, it sort of just exacerbated things. So I think in many respects, it brought forth the urgency for the work needed for redevelop across our diocese. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces, that we might have been developmentally at a different place if it were not for COVID. And I think that really is the change. As a part of that, my experience of working with bishops today, many bring much greater sense of urgency to the work themselves. They understand the urgency, and there's this sense that they need to be engaged much more quickly in dealing with and looking for systemic, structural, and adaptive changes, where I think previously a lot of us, or even bishops that predate me, would have thought, we have a long tenure here, we have time to make some changes, and that I don't think there's that luxury anymore. And part of that's obviously our culture and all sorts of other changes. But I think all of the bishops in DVI and other bishops I work with, I think urgency is my word of the day, as they sense the need for urgency and the change to make adaptive changes and deeper systemic structural changes as soon as possible.
And I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists if you could unmute yourself so we can have an open conversation. Obviously, the three other bishops, you've been in your tenures in shorter terms, but would you agree with Brian's basic premise? What about you, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think going back to 2008, when Phyllis Tickle wrote her book, she predicted that technological change was going to drive a transformation of our entire society, and invited the church to begin thinking about that then. I don't think anybody could have imagined the dramatic impact that COVID had, where literally in the space of about 10 days, every church in the Episcopal Church developed an online ministry and developed an online worship presence. If you'd have said before that we would do it, we would have resisted and said no way. But we actually all did it and have been trying to adapt. What does it mean to be church ever since? What we're convinced here in the Diocese of the Rio Grande, which is all of the state of New Mexico and the far west part of Texas, we're a diocese that is over half mission congregations. It's a geographically dispersed diocese with a few major urban centers. And the challenges that are faced by our rural congregations and those faced by our urban congregations are very different. But part of what I'm aware of as a bishop who's been in place now I'm in the 6th year, is that the structures that our church was built to function are not serving the needs of our congregations, no matter what size they are. And so we are not just doing technical changes, tweaking things, changing the wheels on the car so that you can get another vicar in your mission who will serve you basically full-time while being retired from ministry. That's not happening anymore. We are not just doing adaptive changes, not just changing our canons, although we're doing technical work, we're also doing adaptive work, but what we're really focused on is what we're calling profound change, which is changing the nature of our hearts and changing the nature of our relationships. We think that instead of having basically a governmental relationship between churches and dioceses, that we need a very different kind of relationship. And instead of a basically hierarchical relationship between congregations and dioceses, we need to have a different kind of relationship. And in terms of the economics of being diocese, the old ways of kind of everybody pays their fair share and then the diocese has grants that trickle down to those congregations in need, those kinds of economic relationships are not useful or functioning anymore. And so we're trying to imagine what a diocese would look like if it was not being held back by the way we've done church for the last 100 years.
I think part of that shift is what we've talked about along the way, and talked about this in Minnesota, and I see this pretty consistently. And it'll be interesting to see as we elect the next presiding bishop, is often framed around moving from regulatory to resource. How do we resource our congregations rather than regulate? I think that's a big part of the change, Donald.
Phoebe, I'm going to ask you, Brian mentioned the issue of urgency. And I think one of the problems that we have in the church is that we don't have a sense of urgency. And we often talk about, it'll happen in God's time. And while I appreciate that theologically, I think that God also has a sense of urgency. I even talk about in terms of kind of Advent expectation. Something's got to happen and we have to be part of it. What would you say in your diocese is the most urgent issue facing you that you need to kind of deal with it yesterday, if you will?
Yeah. So kind of like Michael, I'm in my 6th year as Bishop of the Diocese of West Tennessee. We are the western third of the state. The entire state of Tennessee was one diocese for about 150 years. And West Tennessee was carved off in 1982. And then East Tennessee in 1985. And the middle third of the state retained the name, the Diocese of Tennessee. And as I think about, the men and women around the table in the late 1970s, envisioning 3 separate dioceses, all of which were going to grow, right, to hopefully have 70 to 90 congregations. The reality is that all 3 dioceses in the state of Tennessee have had declines in membership since we were split up into thirds. And Donald, I think, just being honest about the reality that we're facing is one of the urgent things, and to not look back with shame or with judgment on what a prior generation may or may not have done. They made the best decisions, I believe, in a faithful and diligent fashion based upon the circumstances they were facing. And in 2024, I'm facing a whole new reality. And so what I have to do is to try to live into the reality of my circumstances to the best of my ability. Like Michael's diocese, more than half of our congregations are mission, many of them in small rural communities that have experienced significant population decline for all sorts of reasons over the past several decades. And so if you've lost 25 or 30% of the population in the city, of course that's going to have an impact on the church and all of the institutions in that community. So the reality is that a lot of our small churches are never going to be able to afford a full-time priest. So in addition to sort of this general dealing with the realities, it's how are we going to equip lay folk to be faithful shepherds of these flocks? Because in some ways, the small congregations in my rural communities are such an important symbol of hope and light, even more so than being in Memphis with all the wonderful variety of Episcopal congregations that you can be part of. You know, in some of our smaller areas, that one church is the only one for miles around. And so we don't want to lose that powerful witness. And so how might we re-envision and reimagine what it even means to be church if you may have a supply priest once a month? What does that even look like?
Doug, you're also part of a diocese that was carved up or carved out several years back. What is the sense of urgency that you sense and feel in your diocese?
Well, unlike Bishop Hunn and Bishop Roaf, I'm coming up on 18 months as bishop. And so
post-COVID bishop, right?
In a different, slightly different place. So for me, part of what is most urgent is figuring out, in fact, what is most urgent, right? Because it all feels urgent in these first couple years of Episcopal ministry. So I think that for a lot of new bishops, just trying to figure out the landscape and what in fact needs to be addressed first and how we can begin to work on both technical fixes and adaptive change. I would echo a lot of what Bishop Hunn and Bishop Roaf said about sustainability. Our diocese was formed in 1969. There was a special meeting of the General Convention that year. Presiding Bishop John Hines gave his address, and the first line was, "People are leaving the church." In 1969. So our diocese was formed at a convention where decline was acknowledged in the first sentence of the presiding bishop's address, right? So I just think it's important to name our history. Now in Southwest Florida, we're 12 counties on the west side of the state: Tampa, Sarasota, Bradenton, Fort Myers, Naples. That's kind of our central areas of urban development. And we are, unlike other parts of the country, actually growing significantly in terms of demographics. So we have a different set of challenges. And yet planting churches and developing ministries the way we did it in 1975 or 85 or even 95 isn't going to work anymore. So finding new sustainable models of ministry that are outside a lot of our canonical categories, right? The last two things I would add to what Michael and Phoebe said is I'm a big fan of Phyllis Tickle. And I think one of the things that she named is that if we are in fact in the midst of an emergence, we can't see what's emerging because we're part of it, right? And so we're in this place of unknowing and kind of feeling our way into this. And the kind of change that we're looking at is not just technical, not just adaptive, it's what I would call cultural change, looking from the top to the bottom, our assumptions, our preconceived notions, the ways in which we think things are supposed to work, all of that, I think, is on the table.
Phoebe made an interesting point that I'd like to kind of explore a little more, that we have to be honest about the numbers. I think sometimes we ignore the numbers or hide the numbers, or we say it's not about the numbers, it's about engaging in God's mission in the world. My response often is, yeah, but you need people to engage in God's mission in the world. So as bishops, how do you kind of, acknowledge the reality with candor and honesty, but at the same time proclaim a hopeful vision for the future and maintaining that balance without being unrealistic or untrue to your role and what you see as the future of your diocese and the church? And I'm going to ask Michael, because obviously, from what I know and from our conversations, you are actually delving into the very core of your being as a diocese, which is both exciting and scary as hell. So how do you maintain that balance, though?
Yeah, thanks, Donald. And one of the things I want to name in the spirit of honesty that Phoebe was talking about, I think our Episcopal Church all across not just the country, but in all the other 16 countries that we are in, that we have not yet taken seriously the huge demographic shift that is about to happen in the next decade. We have been talking for a long time, and every church I go to says, Bishop, we're all gray-haired now, and we're all getting older. But the reality is, and we see these demographics now, that the baby boom generations, the birth rate started to decline in 1969, right? That same year that Doug was talking about. And the baby boom absolutely swelled church attendance in ways that were not the case for the 100 years before that. And so part of what we are seeing in terms of decline is the natural result of a declining birth rate and the baby boom generation kind of moving on. But the reality of what that means for us as a church is that our whole church and everything that we understand as normal was created by and for the baby boom. All of the Sunday school classrooms that are now empty in many of our churches were built for the GI Bill soldiers coming back and the children that they were bringing to churches. The generation that we call the baby boomers have led and funded and inspired all the ministry that we understand as normal. And as that generation prepares to hand the baton over to Generation X and the millennials, who, by the way, the millennials are 45 now. They're not kids anymore. I mean, we gotta remember, like as that same generation that was leading the church coming out of the campus ministry era of the 1960s are still most of our delegates to General Convention. They are most of our people to Diocesan Convention. They're most of our vestries. And their pledges are funding everything. And in the next 3, 5, 8, and 10 years, as those pledges are not there anymore, that is going to be a huge resource drain. Not just, I think we're going to feel it first financially, but then we're going to feel it in terms of volunteers, and we're going to feel it in terms of wardens, and we're going to feel it in terms of clergy. So I think that, you know, some dioceses have a better margin because they've got more endowed funds or that kind of a thing. But in a diocese like ours, which doesn't have endowment funds to speak of, where we're living pretty hand to mouth, we have got to figure out how to be a diocese in a different way. And the first step, as you said, Donald, is telling the truth about that. And people don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I mean, I would much rather let's do some church growth. The fact is, our churches are growing here in the Rio Grande. We lost 0 churches during COVID. Every church is growing, but 65% of our churches have not kept pace with inflation in the last 5 years. So our churches are growing, but we're not keeping pace with the rising cost of healthcare. We're not keeping pace with the rising cost of inflation. We are not keeping pace with the way inflation is growing. And we got to be truthful and honest about that. But we also have to hold on to, and this is the second part of your question, Donald, the more I read about the younger generations, and I'm talking about people under 40, people under 30, these are folks that have not been raised with a positive understanding or experience of church. These are folks who bring their spiritual questions to the internet before they would ever imagine showing up at one of our Red Door churches on a Sunday morning. We are not in the conversation that they are already having about their spiritual lives. But if you look at the demographic data and the spiritual questions they're asking, they are yearning for community. They're yearning for a community that will allow them to address their spiritual questions. They want a church that is open to women in leadership at all levels and is affirming of GLBTQ folks in all levels. I got to tell you that if I had to pick which denomination I would want to lead into the next 30 years, no question it's the Episcopal Church. Because all of the other churches, the big box churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the other denominations are not as well positioned to hold both the ancient tradition that we proclaim as a part of the apostolic line in the Episcopal Church, and a polity that has always welcomed everybody to help make our decisions. Now, I think we need to work on how we do that. But I think the gospel is still the gospel. Jesus still died and rose from the dead, and people still need to hear that good news. The problem is our little Episcopal Church is literally not in the conversation where that conversation is happening. And so in addition to this big demographic shift that's coming on, we've got to get serious about the fact, I think Doug referred to it, we are what the futurist Amy Webb, who is one of the stars of South by Southwest, Amy Webb calls everybody alive right now Generation T, meaning we are the generation that is involved in the transition that is happening as artificial intelligence and wearable technology and global data systems are changing everything in our society. This is what Phyllis Tickle was predicting in 2008. It's actually happening now. And the reality is that spiritual questions, moral questions, ethical questions are being discussed and talked about. Fortunes are being made and lost. And we are sitting in our churches having a conversation with ourselves. So I think the issue is if we can get serious about our faith and figure out how to communicate who we already are, young people are looking for a place like us. They just never heard of us. And they don't know that going to church might be valuable. But last week, I was at a high school graduation party, and I happened to be sitting at a table with a bunch of teenagers who were in the choir at the cathedral. And I thanked them for their ministry and the work they did. I said, thanks for working every Sunday. You make the church what it is. And 5 young people then said, Bishop, it's not work. I love church. I don't know what I would do with my life if church was not a part of it. I look forward to it all week. I think about what was in the sermon during the week after. Like, the church is necessary to my life. And these are 16, 17, 18-year-olds that are telling me this. So I have huge faith. And I understand that young people are yearning for a church like ours. My concern is that our structures and our communication styles are having a conversation that's just not even where the conversation is anymore.
Donald, if I may, the piece I would only, if I may, Michael, that I would add to your demographic piece there is the real shift in terms of persons of color, or as some people refer to, the browning of America. So there's just this huge demographic shift as well, which I think has a potential to have impact in our church if we pay attention accordingly.
Yeah, and we're facing that in a real way here in the Rio Grande. We are New Mexico, we are far west Texas, and this is a culture that is predominantly Roman Catholic, but it is predominantly English-speaking, multi-generational American Roman Catholic. And the reality is that those folks are looking for a church, but many of them are not actively participating in their Roman Catholic churches. And I am concerned, as the Bishop of the Diocese of the Rio Grande, that the Episcopal Church is becoming what I would call an ethnic church, which is to say that the Episcopal Church is perceived as an Anglo-only church because of the style of our buildings, the style of our music. We are perceived as kind of the latecomer Anglos around here because we don't have santos. We have stained glass windows that show our saints. And I'll just share one story that broke my heart. I was in one of our congregations in El Paso, and I met a Hispanic gentleman who was in his 60s. And he came up to me and he said, Bishop, I grew up in this neighborhood and I knew I would never be welcome in this church. And I said, oh my goodness, tell me why. And he said, well, it was because of the sign. The sign says a church in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And I knew that what that meant was that's a church for white Roman Catholics. And I thought, here we are thinking we are talking about a liturgical style, but in reality, those words mean a very different thing. If you are a person of color, if you are of a Hispanic culture, and if our church is going to still be here and thriving in this part of the world, we have to not be perceived as the Anglo-white church. And that's what we were historically. We were the English-speaking church because we were the only one that you could speak English in around here. But now that is a total liability.
Doug, demographics. And first of all, Michael, I always give you a credit, a shout out, if you will, is when you ask your congregations, not only, average pledge, but the demographics of your pledging units, because I know from my own parish, the top 5 pledgers are probably over 75. So, Doug, as an aging baby boomer, I turned 70 this year, and as you know, I'm retiring at the end of the year. Now, Southwest Florida, I know it's probably a more diverse population, but there are a lot of retirees who I assume populate and support a lot of your local congregations. I'm familiar with Iona Hope, for example, which was a parish of kind of an upscale parish, one of my former board members. How are you dealing with kind of the demographics and the whole issue of the financial supporters and the leadership being basically gray-haired folk?
Well, I would say it's one of the things that's actually in our favor in Southwest Florida is the fact that we have a steady stream of retirees that are moving into the area. So congregations that I was a part of 20 years ago that said, look, we're 50 folks over 70. In some cases, there's still 50 folks over 70. It's just a different 50 folks, right? So so there's this way in which we are able to have some sustainability because of that continual growth and replacement. But we're trying to look at the diversity of our diocese because the growth that we're seeing is certainly in the retiree demographic, but young professionals are growing. I'm here in parish, and they're projecting 10 to 15,000 new homes just within the 5 to 10 miles of where I'm sitting. Many of which are young professionals that are going to be working in Tampa and St. Pete and commuting. So that demographic is there. We're also focused on our Hispanic Latino demographic, which is growing significantly in Southwest Florida. So our theme this past year has been one diocese, and we're focusing on really living into our diversity as a gift and as part of our strength, and intergenerational ministry and campus ministry, and bringing all of those together as part of a common mission and common purpose.
Phoebe, we're talking about kind of diversity. As a Black woman bishop in West Tennessee, what have been some of the challenges and opportunities that you have perceived as kind of succeeding more, let me say, traditional bishops? And how do you see that as a vision for the future of not only your diocese, of the wider church?
Yeah, again, I think to sort of name the obvious is just kind of who I am. And my sense is that regardless of our sort of demographic characteristics, increasingly dioceses are electing men and women who are willing to be honest about where we find ourselves. In many ways, the Episcopal Church in West Tennessee does reflect the traditional church, right? I'm in a diocese where probably the Shelby County and the surrounding counties are 60% Black and Latino. The diocese is more than 90% white in terms of membership. And so one of the things that I often note on a Sunday morning when I'm doing a visitation, and we always have some sort of an adult forum or a rector's forum, or, ask the bishop questions, is just say, I'm the only person in this room who's of color beside the sexton. Again, you're not in a sort of a judgment, but just sort of say, okay, let's just hold this up, right? Can we sort of acknowledge this? And then let's sort of begin to think about what that might look like when we are literally in a part of the state that is predominantly Black and brown. And how might the diocese encourage people to be more connected with the community surrounding the church building? So one of the things that we adopted in January, and we took it from initiatives in the Diocese of Oklahoma and the Diocese of Alabama, is they had a grant program, a ministry and mission grant program for their small mission congregations. And the grants are for outreach initiatives. You can't use it for deferred maintenance. You can't use it for internal programming. It's got to be a way in which you are connecting, hopefully by collaborating with other congregations in your area of different denominations or local nonprofit or community-based organizations to do something that is mission-oriented. So we offered up to $50,000 in grants of up to $5,000 each. And we had 15 churches apply, and we've given 14 grants and working with the 15th congregation on them tweaking their application. So we're going to end up giving about $40,000 out this year. And if you're a small church that can barely afford a supply clergy rate, 52 Sundays a year, to have $3,000 or $4,000 to think about, what does a neighborhood-based arts program for either local senior citizens or local youth look like? Or what might it look like to renovate a playground that's within walking distance of the church? Like, what sorts of things might we do to be more connected with our neighbors? And so we are really hopeful. This is the first year of a multi-year grant initiative. And so really rethinking, how do we change some of the ways in which the diocese has traditionally spent money so that we are actually being more of a resource for our congregations? So that ministry grant program is one of the things that we're doing. We have heard from some of our churches that are growing that it would be helpful to have some more administrative assistance. So we're thinking about that, but always, I think, Donald, through the lens of the baptismal covenant, right? Which is to seek and serve Christ as all persons, to love your neighbor as yourself. And me doing community-based events, public invocations, and things of that nature is hopefully a sign to people in the community that the Episcopal Church is serious about making room at the table for everybody, but yet it's still got to go beyond me, right? Because if you decide to walk into one of our congregations on a Sunday morning when I'm not there, how will you be greeted, right? How will you be welcomed? So I think that I'm part of that, but really it's going to take a much broader sense of welcome and engagement to make deep inroads. But I'm really hopeful because I think between our liturgy and our theology, we do have something really beautiful that could be a great benefit to a lot of people in West Tennessee. And I agree with what Michael said. Oftentimes, the issue is people don't know us. And I'll just sort of give this as an example before I conclude. When I came in 2019, I started doing things such as Urban League Luncheon, the Black Bar Association Luncheon. And as I was, moving in these different circles, and I would introduce myself as the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of West Tennessee, many African Americans said, "Episcopal what?" Like they never even heard of the Episcopal Church. And that got me to thinking, we hear about Calvary in Memphis or Holy Communion in Memphis or St. John's in Memphis. We don't say Calvary Episcopal. We don't say St. John's Episcopal. We don't say Holy Communion Episcopal. So when I started naming our congregations, people were like, "Oh yeah, we know Calvary," but they don't know that it's Episcopal. So how might we at the congregational level do a little better job of sort of saying, yeah, we're Episcopal and we're proud of it? So there's just, the bar's pretty low in terms of our visibility in the larger community.
There are several comments about, Michael talked about kind of financial sustainability and messaging. Phoebe, you kind of talked about kind of just letting people know who we are. And I think, the small grants for congregations or local faith communities to connect with their neighborhood is kind of a great innovative idea. I mean, I would suggest that our polity and our structures have been designed to basically thwart innovation and change. And probably even thwart communicating who we are in a changing church and world. So what do we do about that, or how do we work around it? And I'm also going to ask you, is our polity also basically has dispersed authority. So how do you use your role or authority as bishop to effectuate systemic change, cultural change, total change? Recognizing that there is going to be resistance. And how do you overcome that resistance? And if you are, this is a long question, but if you are making some substantial change, how do you avoid kind of defaulting to the status quo? I know it's a long question, but I'm going to ask Doug. And Doug, I know you're still 18 months in, but I'm sure you had to hit the ground running. So I'm going to ask the most junior bishop on the panel to respond to that. Using your authority for overcoming obstacles in our polity, using your authority for innovation and change, and trying to avoid defaulting to the status quo. Those are the three areas I'd like you to address.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine, the Reverend Dr. Donna Moat, preached a sermon a few years ago that's sort of gone viral, in which she said, Christ will come again, the 1950s will not. Right? And so when we talk about structure and we talk about our polity, I think so much of what we're facing is sort of these embedded assumptions about if we do this, then this will happen. And it's just not working anymore. In my context, I think the thing I'm learning is that so many of our structures are predicated on the assumption that most of our congregations are financially stable and self-supporting, right? Even though they're not, the structure is predicated on that. And so whether it's our apportionment system, our budget, our deployment, our deanery structure, congregational development, commission on ministry, all of those parts of our structure are sort of predicated on that assumption. So that's my starting point, is we need to have a conversation about that. If that's no longer the reality, or to Michael's point, not just being reactive to data that we have known about for 30 years, but to be proactive to trends and data sets that we already have about what's coming. That's what energizes me and the kind of work that I want to do in the diocese and with my colleagues in the House of Bishops. How do we do that? We've talked about moving from regulatory to resource, and I actually brought that to some of my clergy colleagues here in Southwest Florida, and they said, "Yeah, Bishop, that's great, but if the diocese is a resource, it's still a resource that we can take or leave, right? We can opt in or opt out, and I think we're in a season where we need everybody in if this is going to work." In our diocese and as well across the church. If I'm doing something innovative in Southwest Florida and we're not addressing church-wide structure and polity, I can only go so far. I need the partnership of my neighboring diocese. Like, take deployment, right? If I develop a whole new deployment system in Southwest Florida, I can only do that to a certain degree before I hit a wall, because I've got to work through the broader systems. So I'm really working to go deeper than just resource, and to really look at partnership and collaboration and relational ministry, where there's a culture in which we really believe that we need each other. Whether you're the biggest 1,000-member church or the smallest rural church with 12 people, both are equally important in the life of the diocese, and that we need each other. And I think that's really the answer to the last part too. To make this sustainable, we have to have the buy-in from both our lay leaders and our clergy leaders. I quote Bishop Andy Doyle a lot in this diocese, where he says that the 1979 prayer book envisioned a lay-led, clergy-supported church, and we persist in trying to maintain a clergy-led, lay-supported church. Hope I said that right. So we are really trying to flip that script and look at what it means for our congregations to really invest in lay leadership. And we have a lay pastor in place in one of our congregations, which is going really well. But I think that cultural change and buy-in is what makes this sustainable over the long haul, because it won't just be about me, Bishop Scharf. It'll be about the diocese coming around a common mission and common purpose.
I'm going to move to kind of general convention. And I think those of you who know me is that I'm not a big fan of general convention. I think it's an anachronistic institution that needs to be totally revamped, but that's a whole separate issue. But Michael, you've been kind of a prophetic voice, and you've often said that unless we do something significant, the Diocese of Rio Grande, as we know it, will not be here at some point in the future. How is this message being received by your colleagues in the House of Bishops or in your conversations throughout the wider church? And how do we get the wider church, including the General Convention, to embrace these new ideas that it ain't working? Or how is it working for you, to quote Sean Rowe? So I'm going to ask you, Michael, because you have been, pretty prophetic in your proclamation about the state of your diocese and the church.
Well, I do think that we, and not just in this diocese, I think the Episcopal Church is facing what I call an existential crisis, which means our existence is on the line. And we can spend a lot of our time and energy kind of sending resolutions to General Convention to create grants that are going to create, 15 dioceses can each get a $30,000 grant to plant a new church. That is not going to stop the existential crisis that's coming. And so the example I'll choose, one of my colleagues in the House of Bishops pointed this out as I started to talk about my concern looking across the church at, for example, the 3 dioceses in Wisconsin are combining. There's conversations in Province 1 about Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine combining. There's conversations in Tennessee and on the West Coast as well. And of course, in the middle of the diocese, we have bishops looking. In the middle of the Episcopal Church in this country, we have bishops looking after multiple dioceses, and Michigan's coming together. But the way we are responding to that is still from this basic idea that every diocese gets what it can afford and no more. We are still in every diocese working on every congregation gets what it can afford and no more. And I firmly believe that if we continue in that kind of market-driven approach to church, we can predict what's going to happen, which is what happens in marketplaces. The rich ones get richer and the poor ones die out. And that's healthy competition in a marketplace, but it doesn't look like the Book of Acts. And it doesn't look like those that have the greatest need are not left to starve to death, and so I would hope that our Episcopal Church would begin to adopt Book of Acts values instead of just letting kind of marketplace values decide where our dioceses are and where our churches are. As I started to talk about this in the House of Bishops, one of our colleagues pointed out that 15 years ago, there were 11 seminaries in the Episcopal Church. And those 11 seminaries were all doing full-time residential formation of priests. And whether you think or appreciate locally formed ministry or not, the reality is that over the last 15 years, we have all watched as market forces have decided which seminaries live and which seminaries don't, and which seminaries are forced to shift to a local or hybrid model, and which dioceses are able to afford to send people to which seminaries. We have allowed those market forces to tell us how clergy are formed in the Episcopal Church. And we could have made a different choice. Going back to the 60s and 70s, we could have decided we want to fund priestly ministry because we think it's important, and here's how we're going to do it. But instead, we just let the chips fall where they may. And my concern is that that's about to happen with dioceses. And in my diocese, it could happen with our churches unless we intervene. Unless we intervene in this diocese, I can predict that 10 years from now, we will have churches in our big urban areas where there's enough critical mass to pay for those churches. But in our smaller churches, if we continue with this idea that every congregation gets only what it can afford, if you can afford a quarter-time priest, that's all you get. If you can afford 6 priests, you get that. If you got a big endowment because someone gave you a sweetheart deal, Maybe you can afford to have a full-time priest even in a small place. But the reality is we've got to start changing our structures so that we make sure that the Episcopal Church continues to exist in Province 9, in Europe, in every part of the United States, including small towns in rural America. We have to start, I mean, it breaks my heart that dioceses like Alaska or the Episcopal Church in Navajo land have to come every 3 years to the convention, sort of pleading for their block grant. And I'm wondering if our diocese might become a missionary diocese sometime in the future, you know? But currently, in order to get two dioceses to talk about combining, you got to get both standing committees and both bishops to agree on changing their canons to even talk to each other. And those kind of apparatuses are not really encouraging us to go back to a place where we've got to start working on the existential things. We got to start making sure that the Episcopal Church exists in every county. You know, maybe that's a place to start. Just looking at the United States, I want to make sure that the Episcopal Church exists in every county, because where I am in New Mexico and far west Texas, it's often 100 or 200 miles from one Episcopal church to the next. And out where I am, that means it can be 200 miles to the next church where your baby can be baptized if you've been divorced. It can be 100 miles to the next place where if you're gay or lesbian, your worth as a human being and your relationship with your spouse or the person you're dating is actually valued and upheld. It can be 200 miles to the next place. So it's not like we can just sort of combine churches and yoke them up and send one priest to look after 5 places. We've got to reimagine what the church is, because the good news as we proclaim it needs to exist in those small rural places. It needs to exist in Alaska. It needs to exist in the Midwest. And if we as a church decided that mattered to us, there's plenty of money, people. We got plenty of resources. But the way those resources are being worked now, you can get it if you can afford it. And I think that's got to change. That's why I'm saying we need profound change of heart. I've got to care about and love not just my little church and my little building, not just my little diocese. I've got to care about the existence of the Episcopal Church everywhere. And change of relationships. We got to be diocese in a different way. We've got to be General Convention in a different way. We've got to make resources available to make sure our churches don't die out.
Donald, can I add something?
Yeah, Phoebe, please, because Phoebe, you also mentioned kind of 3 very large thriving congregations in Memphis. I mean, how are you dealing with this issue that Michael talked about? Small rural congregations without resources and kind of very large congregations in the urban centers.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate in that the large, well-resourced churches in the diocese have been very generous in terms of both associates and rectors going out and doing supply work at the smaller congregations that don't have consistent clergy. So that's been a good blessing about being here. But to hear Michael talk about the various dioceses that are considering some sort of partnership, I'm thinking about also, Michael, the conversation happening in Indiana between Bishop Jennifer and Bishop Doug. It seems to me that there's a lot of creativity and innovation, but it's coming from the bottom up, right? And so we are in a season where we will be electing both a new presiding bishop and a new president of the House of Deputies, conceivably, right, in less than a month when we're in Louisville. And my sense is that every presiding bishop has brought a specific skill set to what that particular era in the life of the church required. And wouldn't it be fabulous if our next presiding bishop really used his or her authority and platform to facilitate more of these sorts of conversations and to encourage more collaboration and partnership, and to think creatively, not about how to circumvent our Constitution and canons, but how can we do creative things within the framework that we have until we can make some changes. I feel like dioceses are doing things, and then even congregations are doing things individually, but there's a lot of reinventing the wheel. And so why can't we figure out a way to share best practices or what we're learning from these various initiatives that are already taking place, because that could be something that could work in my context. But right now, everything is happening almost in siloed ways. So I would love for our next presiding bishop to sort of make this kind of work more of a priority. And again, that's no knock on Bishop Curry or Bishop Jeffrey Shorey or Bishop Griswold. Like, everyone was living into their era. I think today's times, certainly in the post-COVID reality, is calling for a whole different way of being.
Donald, can I also add to that briefly?
Please, Doug.
Yeah, just, Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Famously. And so I think we need to also address the reality that embedded in this structural work is the cultural work. I think one of the reasons why Trek, a decade ago, didn't go very far was because we hadn't really had the cultural conversation to go with that, along with other conversations. I think your question, Donald, about bishops, as a relatively new bishop, although there's been like 17 bishops elected just since I was consecrated, right? So almost one a month on average. So there's a significant change demographically and otherwise happening in the House of Bishops, which is really encouraging to me. And I think we're seeing the cultural work happening in the House of Bishops, and I'm hopeful that that will begin to have a significant impact as that sort of begins to have its effect on structures and other things in the church. I just want to raise, as we're talking about money, right now, I read recently that we have $4.5 billion in land and buildings at the parish and diocesan level. And so I know Bishop Jennifer in Indianapolis and others are really looking at land and how we can better leverage those resources in the service of mission. We kind of haven't had to have those conversations because we had other ways to support the mission and ministry of our diocese. But when we're talking about sustainability, pledging going down, the ratio of pledge to operating expenses in our congregations, they need to look at other sources of revenue. And another stat I saw is 100,000 buildings will be sold or repurposed in the next 5 years. And that's not just Episcopal churches, that's nationwide. But that's a significant shift happening in real estate. I just want to name that as an area that I think as bishops, I'm looking at to support mission and sort of look at the landscape of my diocese.
And I think there's a lot of dioceses that are doing that, Doug, and I'm glad you bring that up. And I think part of the line, so back to your existential moment, Michael, it's the line around that there could be a future where we have lots of assets, property, and even money, but we have very few people, unless we begin to see doing things in a different way.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of the cultural change. We have to change our hearts and our relationships. This is what every relationship that Jesus initiated in the New Testament was a profound change of heart that led to changing all the relationships in that person's life. And I think we have to build churches and understand our culture as Episcopal Church to be an organization that drives profound change in individuals, and that we represent that profound change by emphasizing we're changing the hearts of our diocese, we're changing the hearts of the people in our congregations so that we do share and collaborate, and that includes money, and that includes buildings. So I think the culture thing that you're talking about, Doug, is absolutely right on. And I just want to make sure that the lens is really big in terms of we need to change our hearts and our relationships profoundly, not just tweak some canons and not just sort of make it easier for congregations to collaborate. We really need to change this idea that you only get what you can afford in your church, and you only get what you can afford in your diocese. And the other piece of that that's coming, and I think we're starting to see it, is that this the technological transition, this generation T that we're all experiencing, this hybrid reality is changing how people engage therapy. Doctors' visits are now televisits. it's changed church. COVID, I've still got people that attend multiple churches. They pledge multiple churches. They're not just a member of the place they attend physically. Their spiritual life is being nurtured and cultivated online at least as much as it is in person. And so in our diocese, part of what we've looked at is I captured a statistic that was shared in the House of Bishops at one of our meetings, that the Episcopal Church today is roughly the same size in number of people that it was in the 1930s. And so I went back to the 1930s in our diocese and I looked at what happened over the decade of the 1930s. How many churches were there? How many clergy were there? How did the place run when it was roughly the size that it is today? And it was absolutely fascinating, because back in those days, we had clergy that were riding the railroad from church to church to church in order to hold church in borrowed buildings. And the church in this diocese grew every year of the decade of the 1930s. And this is before the baby boom. But our diocese also had almost twice as many lay readers as it had clergy in those same years. And so you could see that, like, the lay leaders were really nurturing the congregations, and the clergy were coming in for teaching and sacramental purposes. And so part of what we're talking about being a diocese in a different way and transforming what it means, changing our hearts, changing our relationships. Now, we don't have to wait for the train to come. We've got cars and highways. You can travel 200 miles, spend the day doing ministry, and still be home to go to sleep at night. And clergy can do spiritual teaching, lead vestry meetings, have webinars like this with 300 people listening to 4 bishops, and we're all in different rooms. The way in which this technological change is opening up vehicles to communicate the gospel and changing our polity. I mean, I love the way General Convention is now allowing committees to meet not in person. It's allowing more people to participate in our democratic process, which is part of our value structure, right? But we just have to really embrace this technological change and imagine that your small town, tiny church could have the same benefits that a multi-clergy big city church has by having Bible study led by multiple people online, by having your vicar do some of the meetings with the vestry online, and by having 2 or 3 clergy that are driving through town every Sunday to bring you the sacrament and do the teaching, but holding it all together with this kind of communication. I mean, we've just got to embrace the tools that are available to us now to do what St. Paul did. I mean, I keep asking, like, what would St. Paul do with a Twitter account? You know, I mean, it's the same apostolic ministry of traveling around, spreading the gospel, and then connecting by epistles or letters. Used to be emails. Get rid of email as far as I'm concerned, but let's meet, you know, online and in video stuff. We're still doing the same stuff they did in the first century. We just have really sexy tools now.
Look forward to that first AI bishop, Michael.
Let me, you kind of mentioned it, the whole issue of clergy deployment, theological education. You know, they talk about a clergy shortage is because people don't want to move to whatever for a quarter-time position. But, you know, alternative formation, bivocational priests, part-time positions. I mean, we always prided ourselves on kind of, you know, a learned clergy who are well-versed in, you know, theology and ethics and liturgics and preaching. What do you see as the future of theological education in seminaries in particular? And how do we form priests for a changing church and build up the laity to do maybe a lot of the stuff that priests are doing in more resource congregations? And I'll start with Doug in that.
Well, I don't think I have good answers. maybe Michael and Phoebe do, but certainly as someone who is sort of entering into a process where I've got folks who started before I became the bishop, right? So navigating through things that were in place at the same time as I'm thinking about changes and where I want to go with the future. A couple thoughts. Bishop Jennifer in North Carolina is a graduate of Fuller Seminary.
Mhm.
And when we were having a Province 4 gathering of bishops, she said that she got a lot of the systems work and, sort of on the ground experience when it comes to leadership development, leadership training that we're trying to implement in a lot of our dioceses. So I think that might be a really practical place to start, is how do we begin to have seminary curriculum that can maintain excellence when it comes to the core competencies around theological education, scripture, ethics, liturgy, church history, all that good stuff, but really prepare them for the church that they're going into, right? That they're not going into the church of 1985 or 1995 or 1955. So we've got to find ways to communicate with our institutions on a local level. Collaborating between dioceses, sharing resources, developing a clear lexicon in the House of Bishops in terms of what we expect with formation, so that we're not all kind of reinventing the wheel in our own context. I think that has to happen really soon, so that we have a sense of the kind of clergy leaders and lay leaders that we need. And that our lay leaders feel like they are actually being formed in ways where they are stepping into, legitimate leadership roles that have a sense of integrity and status within the culture and structure of the diocese.
I think
Phoebe,
one
how
of
are
the
you
things,
dealing-
maybe in this, if I may, Donald, because I think there's a couple other pieces that I think are important. One is we see an increased need and or increase in bivocational. What does that look like in terms of formation? We see less clergy are less mobile now than they have for a long time. Clergy stay, they find a place, they stay there, they have larger family concerns. We also have bishops and or COMs who are desirous of having clergy being formed contextually, serving in different contexts. Or if you come from this context and you understand, to be a clergy person in Grande, there are some universal truths to that, but there's some unique contextual pieces about that context there that is not a part of others. And how do we form and shape clergy and lay leaders, for that matter, who understand about the contextual nuances of where they are? Just a couple other pieces to throw in the mix.
Yeah. Phoebe, how are you dealing with these changing clergy needs and part-time and bivocational and alternatively formed, all that stuff?
Yeah, so the Province 4 bishops a couple of years ago at our December meeting invited the chairs of our Commission on Ministry and or our transition officers to meet with the bishops to specifically talk about bivocational ministry and what's happening across the diocese in Province 4, so we can have more of the partnership and collaboration that we've heard Michael and Doug talking about. I mean, I'm a small diocese. I certainly can't reinvent that wheel. So we're trying to figure out, well, how do we work with others? And I have 3 postulants currently who are at the ACTS program at Sewanee, which is a low residency 2-year program on the bivocational priesthood track. So we're now, the Commission on Ministry is figuring out it's not 3 years, residential. So what do we need to do in terms of augmenting and ongoing formation and mentorship once these folks get back to the diocese? Because their experience of formation is going to look really different than what my 3 years at Virginia Theological Seminary 20 years ago looked at. But the other thing that I sort of reflect on is, if we as Episcopalians were at our height in the early 1960s with 3.5 million people, and we're currently down to around 1.5 million, we have lost over half of our membership. So if we've got enough pew space throughout tech to house 3.5 million people and we're less than half, then we're never going to be able to have a full-time clergy person in all of those spaces. It just isn't going to happen. And so just acknowledging that. And one of the things that I have sometimes underestimated, if I'm honest, is the amount of grief work, right? That you hear not only our lay folks expressing when they are in these small congregations trying to lead them, but also some of our clergy who were formed in a very traditional way, who now find themselves in an evolving context. Even clergy don't always feel like they have all the tools in their toolkit to deal with the issues they're facing. I know I don't always feel like I have all the tools that I need. And so there's a time and a space for us to also figure out, how do we allow people to sort of say, this is where I am, and then figure out ways together, right, as a community of faith, to link hands and sort of move forward. But I don't know about, the other bishops on the call, but there are a lot of people who are really feeling a sadness about the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
I'm mindful of the time. So I'm going to ask another question, and I'm going to start with you, Brian. What church structures are you willing to blow up for the sake of the gospel? How's that for a softball question?
There you go. There's a softball question. So I think there is a good, healthy tension that I think has been consistently in one way or another named here, which is, I always talk about holding the rope. On the one hand, how do we hold on to our valued tradition, history, the culture of who we are, embedded deeply in being Anglicans? And on the other hand, reaching forward in new and innovative ways. I think we have to hold that tension. I think that often is the work of the bishops and other leaders, lay and ordained, is to find that healthy tension. Part of the challenge consistently is folks have been unwilling to change structures, to change systems, to understand that canons have shelf lives. Canons often are predated to where we are today. We have to be willing. That's why what we do, as you know, Donald, with the define, disrupt, and develop, is we have to be willing to disrupt the system in a way, not just to disrupt, but to make it more effective for the present reality that we find ourselves in. And I think all of our folks here today have suggested that's the work really right now. That's the moment we find ourselves. That's the kind of leadership we're looking for moving forward.
Phoebe, you have anything in particular that you're willing to give up or blow up or discard, whatever verb you want to use?
Yeah. We are a hierarchical church. I mean, we can't get around that. Look at the root of Episcopal, right? I mean, we have bishops. So I would never say completely abolish the hierarchy. I think in West Tennessee, we've been trying to flatten it, right? I mean, it can certainly be flatter than it is. I can invite different conversation partners and more conversation partners to be a part of the conversation. And that in and of itself is a transition, right? Because if people are accustomed to the bishop being the person within the system who's called upon to have all of the answers and the diocesan office to do all of the work, sometimes when you invite other folks to sort of take ownership of all of this stuff, there can be some uneasiness within them, right? Because then that means there's accountability and taking things on that they have to do. So I would say I'm really open to rethinking how it is we do church. But I probably wouldn't necessarily blow anything up, but I would be open to changing stuff. Yeah.
Doug.
Well, I'm sort of in the same camp where I think that most of what we have in place is necessary in some way. So we're really about the work of transformation, the work of redevelopment. I guess if I could dismantle some things, it would be the more invisible things, right? the walls of suspicion, the walls of competition, the walls of that, we're still, we've been talking earlier about, we're still a very white church. So walls of racism. So I just think there some of those invisible things, again, I could go back to culture, right? I think those are the things that we need to be talking about, because they are the things that are hindering, I think, some of the key adaptive work that we're talking about. That unless we begin to talk about those things that we don't necessarily see on a website or a spreadsheet or in our canons, those are the conversations I think that I would like to have.
Michael, you seem a little more open to starting from scratch.
Well, I think that in times of change and particularly dramatic cultural global change like we're experiencing right now, that the most appropriate response is to get really in touch with what are our most important values. And I'm thinking about there's a jazz trumpeter named Delbert Anderson who is Dene. He's Navajo, and he comes from New Mexico, the Farmington area, just up in the northern part of my diocese. And one of the things that's unique about his jazz trumpet style is that he weaves traditional Navajo spinning songs into his music. And when he started doing this and he wanted to cut an album, taking these traditional Navajo spinning songs and putting them into jazz, he went to the elders of his community to ask permission. And he talks in a humorous way, kind of saying like, here I am, a Navajo person, asking the Navajo elders, is it okay if I culturally appropriate these traditional songs into jazz? And what he said next is what is really important. He said, I think if I'd asked the elders 20 years before I asked them, they would have said no, because they were worried about the collapse of their culture. But he said, by the time I asked them, we were worried about our young people not knowing the songs anymore, and our young people not having the interest in the traditional stories anymore. And so the elders said, anything you can do to get those songs into the hearts of our people, do it. And I feel like we in the Episcopal Church, maybe in the sense of Christianity in a growing secular world, are nearing the place where the stories that matter to us, that create our lives, are being lost to previous generations. And so I feel like we're the last Jedi, folk. And I feel like we're I'm the last Jedi master here, trying to make sure that the stories and traditions that matter to us as followers of Jesus Christ are being transmitted to the next generations. And so as a bishop, I'm taking special care to actually teach each of our ordinands and to connect with them about the traditions. I think we've got to be focusing on deepening people's personal connection with Jesus Christ, teaching people how to pray, teaching people how to read their Bible, and to build their life around the liturgies of the church, because those stories that we find most valuable are not being told in the dominant culture, and they're not being valued in the dominant culture. And when the dominant culture hears Christian stories, they don't sound like what I understand Jesus to have talked about. So I feel like we have got to be focused more on the teaching ministries going forward, and raise up clergy like Jedi, raise up lay leaders who are prepared based on their own personal faith to share in the adventure of whatever's going to come. And so what I'm willing to let go of is the safe idea that being a clergy person is an upper middle class career path with a solid pension. And I'm willing to reimagine clergy, because I think all of us got into this work because our spiritual life was the most important thing, and we wanted to spend our lives teaching and wrestling with spiritual issues and helping to change the world in our community. And that's, to me, that's Jedi Church, and that's what we got to be focused on. And then the structures can change. We'll figure that out later. I'm not going to start with the structures. I want to start with the heart of the people, and one Jedi Padawan at a time. We got to raise people up in the faith and teach them how to pray and teach them how to connect with the movement of the Holy Spirit, so we can discern together what God is calling us to be in the future.
Well played with the lightsaber, Michael. Well played.
I remember when we first met with your team for DVI, you said if the church were about making disciples for Jesus, everything would fall into place because disciples contribute their time, talent, and treasure. They work for social justice. They're involved in their communities, and they're about preaching the good news of the gospel to the broken world. So well said. I think Haley is coming back to let us know that our time is, speaking of transitions, our time is transitioning. You're muted. You're muted.
Of course that happened. That was a good segue. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for bringing your hearts and your passions, and for being honest. I think that is absolutely something that we all need to be in this moment with each other, with our institutions, and in this crazy ministry right now. Donald, thank you so much for moderating and bringing those questions. I'm going to share a little bit more information on where people can find some additional resources and connect with us. So at this time, I go ahead and invite you all to step away from your cameras. Thank you again so much. Let me share my screen. Okay. The DVI team has been capturing all the questions and comments that came through during the conversation, and we will be following up with individuals where we can. But if you would like to reach out to us, scan that QR code or go to ecf.org. That'll have all of our contact information as well as more information on the Diocesan Vitality Initiative, different congregational programs and resources we have, as well as our endowment management. None of this work would be possible without generous partners around the church who contributed funds towards DVI. This impacts the whole church, and we invite you to partner with us on this initiative as well. If you feel moved to give, please scan the QR code or click the link in the email you'll receive after this. If not, pray. Pray for change, pray for inspiration, and pray for the future of what God is bringing here. We have recorded this conversation and we'll make it publicly available for future listening. And all those links, all these pages, they'll be sent in an email probably tomorrow once everything's put together. And we are going to close our time together with a prayer. So let us pray. Thank you, Lord, for your presence with us. As we depart from this space now, we ask you to bless us throughout the remainder of the day and guide us. Do not let the learning and conversations of this event die, but instead may they continue to ruminate within us and bear fruit in our ministries. We ask this in the name of Jesus and in the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.